And I'm excited and delighted to welcome our final session, session three, and all the speakers. This is a power-packed panel discussion over the next few minutes that we will dive into paving the way to Vision 2030. How to make the future of clinical research a reality today using PGHD or patient-generated health data. And alongside, we would love to invite folks, Charles Viviano from the Office of Product Evaluation Quality, FDA, Jim Carroll, Walgreens Boot Alliance, Shay Mandel from AdvaMed, Daniel Canos from Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, FDA, Christine from the What Light Collective, and Elena from Google for this fantastic panel and one of the last ones for this workshop before we can call a closing. So I'd like to welcome Charles as our moderator, and Charles, take us away.
Thank you, Smith. Welcome everybody to this last panel before closing remarks. Congratulations for staying to the end of a very exciting and informative and insightful 2 days of presentations and comments. There have been so many great perspectives provided over these past 8 hours or 7 hours. Hopefully it'll continue for this hour as well. Too numerous to mention in totality, but just some of the highlights were reminding us to keep the patient centric in this entire process, to keep the patient involved from beginning to end, to identify measures that matter and outcome assessments that matter to patients, and how important that is as we determine for this particular session. We get to have fun and we've been asked to be creative. We've been asked to be visionary. And so we're going to engage in that kind of discussion here. And just to continue to mention the things that have been mentioned that we're going to try to keep in mind when we create or be visionary and be creative in identifying PGHD in 2030 and the Vision 2030 for PGHD. We've heard from items about patient privacy and safety from patients directly themselves, and how important that is in generating trust in that system, in that ecosystem of generating and utilizing PGHD. We've heard about validating. We've just heard about V3 plus, for example, about identifying and validating, or how to go about validating some of those measures that are important in generating quality PGHD that is important to all the stakeholders across this ecosystem. We've heard about the importance of health and tech literacy in this process, right? We've heard very interesting things from the two Graces earlier this morning about how to improve on tech savviness, or how to address those patients who may not be completely comfortable around tech savviness. Some really interesting ideas about using younger family members to introduce that into their families, and using non-traditional sites, hair salons, barbershops, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard about PGHD not only for disease to be applied to diseases and conditions, but also in the settings of wellness and prevention, something that sometimes might get overlooked for PGHD. We've talked about and heard about usage transparency and the importance of patient involvement in governance of their data, where their data goes. Can they withdraw their data? We heard that yesterday from one of our patients and how important that is to patients. So as we build this vision for 2030, we need to incorporate the things we've heard today and the things we've brought to the meeting ourselves. And finally, we've heard how important it is to give that information, the data that's generated, back to patients. How important that is for them to be able to get that information back, to utilize that information, to keep them engaged in the process, and to empower them. Right? We heard a phenomenal presentation by Elena Ismailova at the very beginning about how important and how her whole perspective changed when she was able to utilize her own health data, her own generated data with her healthcare providers. What are the benefits? We've heard about this before. We've heard throughout this discussion what the benefits of using PGHD to decrease the patient burden, Patients can't always travel to a tertiary healthcare where a clinical trial is being conducted. We want to minimize that burden, almost make it invisible for patients to be able to provide that information would be ideal. We've talked about how PGHD can increase patient enrollment and be more representative so that the results of the utilization of the devices and the wearables can be provide information that will thereby make treatments and diagnoses more generalizable to a broader patient population. Different stakeholders can use and are invested in using PGHD, right? Developers can use PGHD to make devices that can capture measures and outcomes that are meaningful to patients and are easy to use. If something's really bulky and uncomfortable to use, I can't imagine patients are going to want to use it in the first place. To provide and to generate high quality data for sponsors to support their submissions to regulatory bodies, and for those regulatory bodies to have high quality data that represent a broad expanse of patients, so they can evaluate data that will be generalizable to the population that will be using those treatments, those diagnostic devices. And finally, to the patients themselves. We just talked about how patients can use their own data or data that are generated in clinical trials that are given back to them maybe in aggregate form or in other forms that we heard about yesterday that can then be used to help direct their care and to make them feel more empowered again. So this session, we've been charged with being creative. What is good? What do we want PGHD to look like in 2030? The utilization and the generation of patient-generated health data. So taking into account, we get the freedom to not be burdened by the current challenges and limitations. It's pretty incredible. That's our opportunity here today. So we have a broad representation on our panel. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you about what you think patient-generated health data generation and utilization looks like in 2030 and how it can best benefit all those stakeholders I just mentioned and others. But to kick us off, I'm not necessarily asking us to start from the very beginning. I'll give us a little bit of a framework, a little bit of a matrix, something to throw up on the wall to kind of, look at, tear down completely if we need to, and rebuild if it doesn't make sense, but to sort of kind of first agree, what do we want patient-generated health data to look like in about 5 or 6 years, ideally. It'll come with challenges. It'll come with the current limitations, and we'll dive into those to the extent that we can and provide some hopefully strategies to address those. So without further ado, and what I'm going to ask as we go around for the first time, I'll ask our panelists to tell us more about yourself. Tell us about, your role, your organization, your experiences here. We're happy to hear that before you go ahead and engage on that first opportunity to speak. So based on all those things, I would put forth that maybe, and this, by the way, this is not an official FDA statement. In all transparency, I scratched this on my pad earlier this morning. So this is just something for us to work off of. But maybe a vision for PGHD in 2030 might be that PGHD is an ecosystem whereby everyone, and I write that largely, everyone has the opportunity to provide their data without limitations of technology or information services, i.e. internet, et cetera, across a diverse, vast array of measures and assessments that matter to patients and are found fit for purpose and thereby appropriately validated, that can easily and routinely be collected and distributed across a scalable infrastructure and platform to data consumers, including providing data back to patients, that is meaningful to them and understandable in a setting that is secure and protects their privacy and includes patient governance of their data, that would engender trust and empower patients in their own care. Pretty lengthy statement. I can go over bits and parts of it again if we need to repeat it. but I tried to hit on a lot of the common themes we heard earlier today. Is this where we want to be in 2030? Can we do better than this statement? Are there things we've left out? Are there things that shouldn't be there? Where should we devote our resources moving forward? And I want to start with our patients, Kristen. So please introduce yourself a little bit further. Tell us about yourself, and then please, let us know what you think about that as a statement or something different.
Sure. So, hello, my name is Christine von Reisfeld. I'm representing the Light Collective. We're an organization working for patient rights, but I am a rare disease and undiagnosed patient myself, and I have used patient-generated health data in my own journey of discovery and trying to find where I am. I've gotten two rare disease diagnoses, not from my physicians, but really from me pushing with patient-generated health data. I was involved in a study at one point with Stanford. It was a precision medicine initiative to see how much patients could take on their own. And I was given a PGX test, a wearable or a blood pressure cuff, and a scale that I was then able to kind of monitor myself. Well, during that time, I also saw significant weight loss. And when I called my physicians and let them know I didn't see them enough, this was monitoring my weight on their scale, right? Set up by their guidelines, never moved so that I didn't upset the settings. And what we were able to determine was that I had a rare brain condition, AAG, autoimmune autonomic ganglionopathy. And that was proven by the data being collected. Otherwise, we wouldn't have even gotten there. But it was me giving these bits of information that we were then able to put together into a story. The second time that patient-generated health data was able to help me was when I went into heart failure. And over the pandemic, I had 8 ER visits, 15 telehealth. I wasn't able to see a physician in person, but I was realizing and seeing through my Fitbit that my heart rate was low. When I was taking my blood pressure readings, it was low. But when I would come into the ER, they didn't see the same things. And so I finally, at one point, after the 8 ER visits and 15 telehealth, asked for a Zio patch to monitor. I asked for a Holter monitor first because I said I had worn that and it had taken my data for 2 weeks. Then they were able to come to decisions. They gave me the Zio patch and I was given a call within a few days of returning it that I was in heart failure. But there were things that were indicative that this may have happened, not only in genomic data that I had collected on myself, but also in the wearable devices. But in order to get that combined and collected, I needed another device that was, medically, a medical grade device to get that information to my physician. So I think there's value in the data that's produced. And I think your statement went really well. The only thing I would add into that is sovereignty over the data. Because I think as we're looking at how the world is going and what's happening, that sovereignty is going to be essential as we build AI systems and really look at algorithms and how we interpret this data. And so I'll leave it at that and close there, but happy to contribute as we go along.
Christine, phenomenal. Great. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I know you have more to share. I'm sure we'll get to it. Bringing up the concept of sovereignty, linked into my comments about including patient governance, but sovereignty, especially in light of the emerging AI and ML technologies, is going to be a challenge, right? It's something we're going to have to face. I think we're scrambling across the board on how to address that, not just in PGHD, but in other areas as well. But an excellent point and something that's very relevant and timely. Thank you. Elena, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Elena, and I work at Google. I come at it from a couple different lenses. From a product perspective, my team works on both wellness and health screening products. So our team worked on features like the heart rate, ECG, AFib, and a lot of what we focus on is how do we think about that user experience? How do we make sure that and what does that mean? Who is the end user? And it's twofold. It's not just the person wearing the device and getting that data. We obviously want to focus on making sure that they understand how to use it and that it's comfortable that it makes sense, that they understand not only what data we're collecting, but also, what they can do with it, and equip them with the tools to then go have that conversation with a clinician, or at least have the ability to track it on their own and know what it means, and take the next steps, and have that level of empowerment and education within the tool. And we think about it in different languages. We serve different countries, but even in our country, there are a variety of different languages. When we think about the user, it's how do we make sure that it really is providing the ability to the majority of the users to use the products and use them effectively and easily. And then I think on the personal side, a lot of the conversations earlier really resonated with me because, I work every day on products related to sleep and nutrition and heart health. And I remember sitting in a room when we were developing some of the AFib products, and my mom got diagnosed with AFib. And it really brought, those two worlds together. And it really brought to light the fact that my mom doesn't speak English. And when going through some of these devices, I worked at Fitbit at the time, now Google, and she probably wouldn't have these devices if I wasn't working here. She may not even know about them. And so, I was that child that provided some of that information to my parents because of a language barrier or because of socioeconomic background. And so it really does hit home of how do we get to those populations? How do we think about them in terms of including them in those clinical trials? But also, if they are given these technologies, do they understand how to use them? Do they understand how to use them for the trial, but also in their day-to-day life? And so one of the things that I loved your statement, Charles, I think the one thing that maybe comes to me, especially as I marry those two worlds for me of, my patient history with my parents and things that I'm predisposed to, and also what I do day to day, how do we think about health going forward and clinical trials, not only in a treatment, but also how do we think about preventative? How do we use this vast data that's now lifestyle and day to day together with the clinical data to think about how do we think more preventative as well? Not just treatment, but how do we allow these clinical trials to focus more on that, given that we have such a breadth of data of your day to day lifestyle and context and other things that we may not have before?
Yeah, I'm just scribbling frantically some notes on things you've said. Two things that really resonate that I think we're definitely going to come back to are, making sure people have access to some of the devices. You said if you were in a Google, would your mother have had, some of these wearables that were important to her? So really great concepts. I know we're going to come back and probably talk about some challenges to that visionary view of where PGHD might be in 2030 and some other ideas that you've brought forward. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this awareness, right? Like not only having different price points, but even just the awareness that these tools exist for people that may not be aware of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's pick up on this when we get to the point of, what are some of the challenges of implementing this vision that we're trying to craft a little bit here. Jim, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. So Jim Carroll. So I am with Walgreens. About 2 years ago, actually, this month, Walgreens launched a clinical trials business, really for the primary purpose of addressing both infrastructure issues associated with clinical trials and structural barriers associated with participation in clinical trials. And a lot of what we do today is focused on bringing research to patients in the communities where they exist. I know we've had a lot of good panel discussions over the last couple of days. The one from this morning that Grail led with Catherine and Jen and Shari, I thought was very interesting. Coming off of a discussion that they had yesterday for White House OTSP. A lot of what we're doing is intended to break down those barriers and bring research into the community where Walgreens has such significant access to diverse patient populations who have been historically underrepresented in research. And when we think about clinical research and trial design, for example, we really think about it from a continuum perspective, right? There's traditional research, done at large academic institutions within urban settings. we'd like to broaden that definition to really include a continuum between traditional site-based research and totally virtual research options. And by making research accessible and available within communities, it really provides another option for patients to participate in research. And a lot of the changes that that we're looking to see, that we're trying to enable today, really needs to start at the design stage. And again, coming back to having good broad awareness of the various options that are out there. We say, in a lot of the discussions that we have with sponsors, it's not going to be really anytime soon that Walgreens is conducting, phase 3 interventional oncology trials. But there are ways for us to work with traditional sites and do some of the lower acuity visits, for example, within communities. So that's a little bit about what we're focused on at Walgreens. And, a lot of that is really underpinned by the availability and the generation of patient-derived health data as really a mechanism, another mechanism to be able to collect additional information from patients in a real-world setting, and in a way that will help to inform a lot of the other endpoints and outcomes that are being collected during clinical trials. We look at that as really a primary need for us to really look to ways to be able to collect this data from patients, really as a complement to, in the post-marketing setting, real-world data collection, or in the clinical trial realm, a nice complement to what is being collected in clinical trials.
Right, Jim. I think, and the PGHD offers us this opportunity not only to collect measures, but to identify novel measures, right? Measures that we couldn't have otherwise identified. Continuous, essentially continuous blood pressure measurements, or heart rate measurements, that as opposed to following up at a trial site at 3 weeks and 6 weeks and 3 months and 9 months, and getting what was described earlier by one of the presenters very accurately, snapshots. Those are snapshots. They may be high on the graph, they may be low on the graph, they may be right in the middle of the graph. We don't know, right? And so PGHD also, not only being able to capture measures, but also I think giving us opportunity to capture novel measures that are richer and provide more information to our patients. But you said something, Jim, that I am going to come back to about infrastructure. It is possibly one of the challenges to making, capturing and utilizing PGHD broadly. More broadly. And I heard something yesterday by a presenter that really stuck with me. And it was, there's a lot of learning that's happening across organizations, maybe at Walgreens, maybe at Google, maybe at other places. But it happens behind these firewalls or in these silos, right? Even maybe in the pre-competitive space. So Shane, maybe you're in a great position possibly to address that, given the organization you're with. How are we going to wind up not having to reinvent the wheel all the time when we tackle some of these limitations to implementing this wonderful vision we're trying to put forward? And by the way, feel free to tear down the vision, add to it, propose a new one, et cetera, et cetera. But Shay, let's hear from you.
Well, thank you, Charles. And thanks to Dime and the FDA for having this workshop. And it is an honor to be with this group of panelists. I think as we talk about the future, I think Christine is the patient that we need and want everyone to be in order to really have, patient-generated health data that we can work with. So Christine's story of her utilization of technology, amazing. Advocacy, amazing. But then you see all the challenges, right? And so I think one of the things that needs to be in place to really utilize patient-generated health data is an ecosystem approach and reciprocity in that literacy around technology, right? So, we make assumptions that sponsors and clinicians, they're the experts in capturing data, and that patients, struggle to have the literacy. There are language barriers. There's meeting them where they are. And I think there's a closing of the gap there that we don't talk enough about. I mean, I think if we're really going to utilize this data to do something with it, right, to focus on outcomes and really have these technologies close the gap, drive to personalized medicine, really be a part of extending clinical trials, this has to work both ways, right? And so Christine outlined a scenario where she captured a piece of data. It didn't tell a physician what it needed to. She wasn't getting the right answers. And so I think utilizing these technologies continuously, right? Getting data on a continuous basis that is allowing for physicians to be a partner, to flag when there's a problem, but for patients to be able to, provide that longitudinal experience. I mean, Christine, you mentioned a scale being in the same place, right? We don't live that way. And different populations move in different ways, have access to different technologies. So if we're really talking about the future, I think Elena mentioned price points and costs, right? We need to be realistic about how we ensure that the right tools are in the hands of patients, that they're affordable, and that the literacy is high and they are in control of their healthcare. And I think that's something, today it's the opposite, right? And so physician burnout, physicians, we're using AI in the clinical setting to try and help operations and workforce burnout. But I feel like all of these issues that we try to tackle in silos, if I'm answering the question, what does the future look like? It's where we finally bring all that together. And I feel like we have a million conversations, right? Whether panels like this, experts like all of us talking about what that looks like. But I think the practical elements of starting to break those silos down. And then to your question, Charles, how do we integrate that and what does it look like? And, I think that's a challenge to paint the perfect picture, because I think part of what we need to do, I think we can paint the picture, right? So from my perspective, this is what it looks like and here's where we are today. And then how do we begin to take these steps? And probably most importantly, what are the steps that if we take, it's the best first domino that starts to, move the other dominoes. And so I've heard patient literacy, right? We've talked a lot about meeting people where they are. Jim talking about, having sites everywhere, CBS being able to engage. But I think ultimately everyone needs to be committed to an ecosystem where patients are comfortable with, advocates for, and are active participants in sharing their data. And they have to have trust in the system. As sponsors, we need to be protecting their privacy, but we need a patient experience for all of us that meets our expectations like it does outside of healthcare. I think we can all agree that's not true today. And so to get to that perfect place, I think there are 3 or 4 or 5 important steps, but I think we can do those things. And I think, we don't have to change everything, right? We don't have to address every regulatory challenge or assume that HIPAA needs to be changed. I mean, I think we've got the framework here. It is patient literacy. It is putting tools in the hands of patients, but it is creating, a reciprocal relationship between patients and their clinicians and sponsors that today, is ineffective to some extent, if not, at the very least, it's not as productive when we're looking at how we're going to utilize this data to improve outcomes, as I think we all agree it could be.
Yeah, thanks, Shay. And I may push back a little bit to get some more granularity on how we close those gaps and make it more reciprocal. I know we all want to identify strategies for making this scalable, to making this real. It sounded like one of the things you were saying at a higher level is, to continue these cross group discussions a little bit and to close those gaps, right? So, and just a point of correction, in my introduction, I was introduced as the Associate Director and Chief Physician in OPEC. I'm the Associate Director and Chief Physician in OSEA, the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, which is in OPEC. But thank you for the promotion. And my boss is Daniel Canos. And Daniel, I'm going to go to you last of the group, in the group. But, does FDA have a role here in what Shay was saying? to continue this conversation, to close those gaps, or are there other organizations that are better suited? And what do you think of what I scratched on my pad earlier about, what the vision is and where we should be with PGHD in about 5 or 6 years?
Thanks, Charlie. So, and pulling in what you asked too, as far as a bit of background, started the FDA in 2008, had about a 4-year sabbatical at Medicare, where I ran the evidence development division within the coverage and analysis group. And so, on the Medicare side, beneficiary access to reasonable and necessary items and services was the focus, right? Supporting beneficiaries making informed decisions about their care, ensuring that beneficiaries were fully informed about uses of their data and maintaining protections of beneficiary data. And those key tenets, also play into some of the core mission here at the center, CDRH, where we're protecting and promoting public health, assuring patients and providers have that timely and continued access to safe and effective, high quality medical devices, providing the consumers, the patients, caregivers, and the providers understandable and accessible science-based information about products we oversee, right? And facilitating innovation, advancing the regulatory science like we're talking today. So patients are the center of that mission. And to get it back to your question about 2030, right? Protecting and promoting public health is really truly establishing a learning healthcare ecosystem, a vision that our Commissioner Califf has shared on many occasions. And so, better integration of that patient-generated health data into EHRs and registries will improve the engagement as well as outcomes. As we've noted, I think across the last 2 days, using electronically collected patient-generated health data, and those outcomes to capture the review of those things that happen outside of clinics won't only improve the efficiency and completeness and accuracy of data collection for those systems, but also provides the opportunity to really operationalize and incorporate that patient voice into the EHR, into these systems. And we've also heard that encouraging patients to contribute information to the medical files not only improves that kind of the medical performance, but supports them to be more invested in healthcare. And so, I think no changes or striking down of what you propose, Charlie, but, I'm a leaper, but also a leaper likes to build with rational steps, right? And so how do we build to that? Our center clearly has been a member of the collaborative community and with a data CC and others, and advancing the digital health measures and research, improving and also kind of partnering too with the infrastructure part, as you mentioned. So there's the engagement, there's the methodology, then there's the ecosystem, and so partners such as the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, that are developing that ecosystem comprised of health systems, commercial data providers, data aggregators, and using that privacy-preserving technology such as tokenization is one example of an ecosystem where this is all being pulled together. To your point, as far as bringing the access to studies and participation to patients, it's not just the digital technology, but it's the access even to the brick and mortar aspects of that, and connecting all these different data systems together, but providing that opportunity. And in doing so, as mentioned yesterday, not creating new barriers to access the care by, only having those with a cell phone have access, but figuring out ways to get that access to other individuals, handing the cell phone to folks that don't have access to cell phone, or people in bad cell areas, allowing for facilities such as what Walgreens is doing with the Boots Alliance for them to, come in person and have that information collected too. So, it's not leaping to the future, but making those next rational steps to getting there. Ultimately, kind of reducing the data collection burden for patients, but also the data collection burden for clinical investigational sites. We've seen a lot of success with integration of patient-generated health data in clinical studies, with high yield rates of completeness only when we super hard push on clinical investigational sites, and that then moves the research for innovative technologies into academic medical centers that can have the resources to have staff on board to get that information, right? And really, decentralizing this and bringing the data collection to the patients will remove these barriers that kind of have been kind of stood up there. Ultimately involving patients in the clinical trial data collection. Some of the NIH studies have really been successful in engagement because of involvement in the community, right? And I think that's really ultimately what we're talking about here.
Right. Thanks, Daniel. I think you've touched on a couple of issues that dovetail with that I'm going to bring back to something that Shay mentioned. This, the circle to close, Shay, I think is even broader than just discussions on PGHD, isn't it? It's really about ideally, and we've heard this from patients, and I'm interested to hear from Christine and Elena again, given their experiences, and of course from the rest of the panel. But why can't we integrate PGHD into EHRs so that patients can then use that information to discuss their healthcare? Why wouldn't that make a richer trove of data that other stakeholders could then use for their purposes as well, right? It's a bigger circle to close, but not impossible. So we have some questions online that kind of go into the next area that I'd like to. So what I've heard is, I haven't heard anybody tear it completely down, the vision. I haven't heard anybody say, nope, that's completely wrong. We have to go in a kind of a different direction here. I see your hand up, Christine. Go ahead.
So I also think we should really look at how we look at health too. And I know prior to our session, I suggested how we kind of map some of this PGHD using a GIS mapping system. And I think looking at other ways to incorporate data and look at the data so that maybe visually we can see some of these things and things stand out a little bit more. So I think that integrating all of these things is great. I think where we do that and how we do it is going to be extremely difficult. I think EHR has valid and viable information that's needed, but I can also tell you, as someone who's struggled with the healthcare system for 49 years now, my EMR is not a valid record of my health. So how do you incorporate the patient insights that may be additional to the EHR and really kind of build on that?
So Christine, that's interesting. Do you think that this effort to sort of gain access and provide and contribute and both receive that your patient generated health in concert with the rest of your health record, do you think that this process can help empower you as a patient to making sure that, number one, the information there is correct, and to have more trust in what's out there and being said about you as a patient from a health perspective? Yeah,
I do. And I think there's a lot of things out there. As a patient, right, I can participate in different research projects. I can try and get into different clinical trials, but all of that information is also going to be on multiple different platforms, right? And so in order to really have a full picture of a person, you've got to return that data back to the patient. I think when we look at where we store this data with one system or another, I have to go back to one system, get permission, get that information transferred over to here. And then I have researchers who we've seen instances where people are manipulating data. And so how do we have a clear reference and a true idea of what the information is and what's coming out with synthetic data being generated? I think you have to return data back to patients and not just the interpreted results that we're getting, right? I think that raw data needs to be returned back, and patients should be educated and given agents and people that can help them access and share that data. I think we're at a really weird point in research where the general public is looking at research for profits, right? They're looking at research being done with no benefits going back to communities. And I think the privacy and security issues are another factor. And so I really don't know, right? I would love to see a platform that enables me as a patient to have all this information given out, and then me be able to share that openly with security in place with people that I see fit. And I think, honestly, if I'm getting down to it, I think if I'm doing publicly funded research, then that raw data should be returned back to me as a part of the public, and then allow me the agency to take that to different people and different researchers and say, this is what I found, and I'm willing to share this with you if there is some kind of benefit. But I think one of the biggest problems we have here is no sovereignty of the data and misaligned incentives. And so how we align all that, I don't know, but I'm open to suggestions. And I think going back to the patient is where it needs to be.
Yeah, it keeps coming back to that. We've heard that from the beginning, and now we're bringing it back up at the end again, appropriately so. And that patient being centric raises a lot of questions and challenges insofar as sovereignty, as you just mentioned. Not to mention the complications of AI and what AI does with the data, and then who owns the data, and then what happens with the data then, or what's generated by AI then, who owns that, et cetera, et cetera. Challenges that are clearly identified and that need to be addressed and put forth with further discussion. Ellen, I was wondering to hear from you. What I heard from you that struck me was the challenges in providing technology and/or services, information services, internet services. You spoke particularly about devices, but I think Shay touched on it as well. How do we make sure that if we're going to reach this vision of broadening who can provide PGHD to everybody, we're going to run across these issues, aren't we?
Yeah, I think the issue of access comes back, right? We know that more and more people have access to phones and smartphones, but it's not everyone. And similarly, as I mentioned, I work on wearables, and it's both wearables, but also mobile apps. There's so many mobile apps. There's Fitbit app, there's other apps out there that could also start to track some information. It may not be as comprehensive as what a wearable could do, but I think there's a variety of options that exist, but a lot of people either don't have awareness or education of how to use them. And when it does come to actual devices or purchasing, we do need to have different price points, because whether it's the patient having those on their own or a clinical study that's being stood up by research or a company, having different price points so that those devices could be provided to people and patients can be helpful and can still ensure that we're implementing wider, bigger trials that incorporate more people and more access. And so I think approaching it from different ways, right? How do we make these readily available so that folks like Christine, who are able and understand the technology well enough to take that into their own hands and talk to the physicians, but also how do we empower the clinicians, the researchers, to know about these technologies and know that there are ways to provide them? How do we partner with organizations that are thinking about Wi-Fi and these areas and pockets that are rural or that don't have access to them? And I think that's where the collective community and partnerships can help. We might not know where all those people are, but there's probably an organization or a company out there that we can partner with. And I think it's about how do we bring these pockets together, to Shay's point, how do we bring the collective knowledge? And I think right now a lot of the wearables, even if they are used in clinical trials, a clinical trial might have to validate, well, which one do I use? Is it this one or that one? What level of information, and is it approved? And having to go through this rigor to even use it to begin with. And I think if we, going back to what could FDA and what could industry do together, if we have a set of it doesn't matter which one you use, all of these are available and can meet the need of the rigor of data and accuracy and interoperability, then you can scale so much faster. You remove that burden from the clinician or the researcher or the patient, because it's just easy. Take your option, and there's so many out there available, and we can go to the next most relevant, fun, and innovation part of like how do you actually learn from the data, and how do you start to analyze the millions of data points that we're going to have available, because there is so much richness in the data out there once we get it in the user's hands.
Yeah, and I think, I think one thing you said earlier was that sometimes people don't even know that some of these devices exist, right? Not to mention different price points and different versions of the device, but sometimes they don't even know that these opportunities exist. And how do we do better about making sure that everybody knows that these are opportunities and they are out there?
And maybe just to give you an example, we partnered both, like we've done both direct to consumer and payer provider. And I think the payer provider is another way, right? If you have insurance, a lot of people don't know that their insurance can provide one of these tools for them to start evaluating and looking at their own data. And so I think that's another way. How do we partner with the folks that do have insurance? How do we partner with those payer providers and make that accessible? But again, we don't want to forget about the people that don't have a way to get those. And I think that's the challenge of where do we focus on that other population that maybe doesn't have the resources or the connection to those institutions.
Thanks, Elena. Jim, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us or give us some insight. It's something that you're excited about, that you might have heard, that might address one of the limitations in implementing this. And Shay, same sort of question here toward the end. We only have a couple of minutes left. I got to confess, when I first heard that we had 50 minutes to talk about this, I thought there'd be crickets toward the end and we'd be talking about something else, but we could actually use more time, can't we? So give you guys the last opportunities, something that's innovative that you've heard or that you're aware of, that you're excited about, that can maybe address these limitations and actually make this vision actually be reality in 5 or 6 years. You're on mute, Jim.
I think as it relates to clinical research, I think a lot of this, a lot of these barriers, right, can be inventoried as part of the initial intake process for participating in a clinical trial. In many cases now, across healthcare more broadly with providers, they're starting to collect information from patients, SDOH data largely, to understand what the individual patient's challenges are so that they can take that into account as they provide care recommendations. I see that now starting to make its way into clinical research, where again, as part of the early intake process for participation in a clinical research study, you can ask the patient, very specifically some of these questions. Do you have access to broadband internet? Do you have access to a smartphone? Do you have access to transportation? A lot of these questions, I think, can get asked early in the process for research participation. And then as that information is collected, I think, we heard this morning from one of the panels that, there are solutions already starting to come into place for this, where you can get broadband access made more available for individuals. You can start to use multimodal tools if patients don't have a smartphone, if their preference is to work, in some other fashion outside of the collection of electronic data. There are ways to, and still, what we might consider a non-digitized way, collect information from those patients in a way that's meaningful for them. And I think there's a training aspect to that as well, right? With the existing tools out there to see if, there's differential training that can be provided to individuals, again, to allow them, better access to these types of devices that collect and can then share patient-generated health data. So I think, we're starting to see some steps as, we're advancing, I think, with a little bit more purpose, this conversation around making research more accessible to all patients. We're starting to, be confronted, if you will, more so with some of these challenges that need to be addressed in order for us to achieve representation.
Thanks, Jim. And I'm going to cede my wrap-up time to you, Shay, to give us the last word here and your vision, your thoughts on the vision moving forward. We only have we're going to be over by 1 minute, but we'll give you that last bit.
I will do this incredibly quickly and let you have the last word. So I think as we look to solve these challenges, I'm a big fan of let's start with the roadblocks and burdens and see what, let's overcorrect there and see what happens. And so, I think clinical grade passive data being collected, Daniel talked about sites, Walgreens is a great opportunity, but where we can get away from sites and get people into the home, we can get people to a Walgreens. I mean, I think that kind of passive data collection, and passive meaning that the patient's being monitored, right? We're not talking about a patient specifically talking about their pain threshold and others, although I think we can have a whole different conversation about those two data sets. But I think removing the burden of having to do everything at a clinical site is an important objective that I think it's one of the things we could solve fairly quickly. And then to Christine's point, the other burden is who owns the data and how are patients empowered? And I think if we could focus on those two things, using technology to get to the least expensive meeting of where people are to increase both diversity and participation in trials, and make sure that patients are driving their data, sharing it as appropriate, and having more control. I think those are the top two things that if I could go out and make changes to move us toward 2030, that would be my choice.
Thank you, Shay. So Jackie, I think to wrap it up, we've tried to be visionary in what Vision 2030 for PGHD would be. You've heard varying perspectives on what that looks like. Actually, we agreed on mostly what that looks like, but you've heard varying perspectives on how to make it happen. Most of all, it requires further discussion amongst the stakeholders, with patients being at the center. So I pass it back off to you, Jacqueline, and thank you to my fellow panelists for participating. Fantastic insights, and we'll hope that vision becomes reality in a couple of years.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to the panel for the robust discussion on the future of patient-generated health data. We will now have closing remarks for this public workshop by our co-sponsors, the Food and Drug Administration, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and the Digital Medicine Society. First off, we'll have Suzanne Schwartz from the FDA.
Right. Thanks so much, Jackie. So my name is Suzanne Schwartz. I'm the director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation, also known as OST at FDA's CDRH. First, I really want to congratulate the organizing chairs for this highly successful two-day public workshop. Smith Patel, Robert White, and Jackie Burgett, you've done an outstanding job. To all of our speakers from across the ecosystem, whether in the public or private sector, clinicians, scientists, developers, entrepreneurs, and of course, at the center, at the heart of everything we do, patients. We are so appreciative of you and of the time you've invested, as well as the insights and expertise you've contributed by participating in the rich discussions we've had over the past 2 days. Indeed, it's an honor for me to speak with you today. At OST, we advance partnerships with patient organizations, industry, scientific, government bodies, as well as other external entities to support patient-focused and regulatory science programs related to the safety, effectiveness, quality of, and access to medical devices. In my closing remarks for this public workshop on patient-generated health data, which I'm going to refer to as PGHD for the remainder of my remarks, I'm going to home in on 3 topics. First, this public workshop is emblematic of the growth and progression of CDRH's efforts related to PGHD. Second, we see PhD through the lens of our OST values of rigor and inclusivity. And finally, 3, we do our best work when we work together. We in OST thrive on public service that is steeped in engagement with all key stakeholders, including medical device manufacturers, clinicians, researchers, and of course, patients, as exemplified over the span of this public workshop. So as a bookend to Dr. Jackie Burgett's opening remarks yesterday, in 2016, we released draft guidance on real-world data, which set CDRH on a path for growth and evolution on the importance of PGHD. In 2018, we convened a patient engagement advisory committee meeting on the role of PGHD in post-market surveillance. We held a public workshop on PGHD in 2021, further underscoring our commitment to patient science. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated the need for better remote clinical trial data, as well as highlighting the need for diversity in clinical trials. Now, the presentations and the stimulating discussions on the use of PGHD in medical device development today and yesterday reflect all of the progress we're making. Case examples zoomed in on implementation of PGHD in remote clinical trial data collection and clinical outcome assessments. We also were privileged to hear a fireside chat with ARPA-H, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Office of the Commissioner. For our second bucket, we view PhD through the lens of our values of inclusivity and rigor. The case examples, the panel discussions, the fireside chats, they all collectively demonstrate the values that we embody in the work that we do. And as a testament to our commitment to amplifying the patient voice in the service of equitable access to safe, effective, and high-quality medical devices, we ensured that every panel had a patient voice, in line with our strategic priority of advancing health equity and improving inclusivity in clinical trials. Importantly, we support rigor in regulatory science and require high-quality PGHD in medical device development to protect patient safety. And so we hope the discussions over the past 2 days, including hearing directly from our very own CDRH reviewers, highlight this commitment to rigor and patient science. And finally, the third bucket is engagement. This workshop on PGHD showcased the value and place of partnerships. We heard perspectives from across the ecosystem and, most importantly, patients. The co-creation of this workshop with our co-sponsor DIME is illustrative of what is possible when we work hand in hand. Thank you to the whole DIME team for being such stellar partners, and we look forward to our continued work together on this front. And a personal call out of heartfelt gratitude to Jen Goldzak, CEO of DIME, who consistently seeks to raise the bar higher and higher, modeling for me and for our team what high performance in serving the public, our patients, looks like. Thank you, Jen. So from OST, I thank you for joining us over the past 2 days. I'm going to hand it directly over to Jen Goldzak, the DIME CEO, for her closing remarks.
Suzanne, powerful closing remarks as always, and thank you so much for that. Those very, very kind words. I value our partnership greatly, and I think that the discussions that have happened today, yesterday, and perhaps more importantly, how we will drive them going forward are a testament to what we can do when we bring our teams together with patients and with the community. Suzanne, I want to echo your thanks to Smit, Jackie, and Robert, as well as all of the FDA and DIME folks behind the scenes, all of our expert panelists, and all of you on the line who have joined us. And, you know, some reflections just briefly from my side on the conversations of the last 2 days. What has become very apparent to me is that the technology is there, and that our regulatory science colleagues and, you know, the sort of corpus of regulatory science, you know, for anyone who's really been listening, our regulatory colleagues support this too in this journey, and patients want this. And there was a really interesting comment from Grace this morning, and Grace, you said, you know, we cannot create another channel for harm. What we want is for this data to help us to improve our lives, to improve the way that our industry cares for patients. And that's our call to action. And there is no reason that we cannot do that, either from a technical or a regulatory perspective, and why we can't do it now. So what I take from the magnificent 2 days of discussions is that it's up to us to act. We need to think about implementation. We need to think about some of these hairy questions around data sharing. We need to think about mechanisms and incentives. And I am absolutely confident that we can do this. Another takeaway I had from today, it's interesting. If you look at any illustration of a medical product development process, you will see that it's linear. Whether it's a medical device, whether it's a drug, we always describe this process of having a start and having a finish. Every single person who has offered remarks, who has typed into the chat or asked a question in the last 2 days has actually made me think about this differently. And it's only occurred to me in the last hour or so that it's actually cyclical. That when we are patient first, we start with the patient. That's where we think about the data and information that is most important for patient first clinical and scientific decision making. And the entire purpose of our industry and the new medical products that we are delivering are to end with improvements in the lives of the patients that we exist to serve. We have to stop thinking about medical product development as linear, and our patients are driving us to think about this as a cyclical process where they are not at the heart of it. They are the start, the finish, and they are the ongoing process that will keep us driving forward. Thank you again, everyone, for your comments, your participation, and your remarks. We take very seriously, both Suzanne at FDA and here at Dime, that we are not here to admire these comments. We will be pushing forward. There is an enormous amount of energy and potential and trust that has gone into what has been shared over the last few days. And our commitment to everyone on the line is that we drive this forward. There are some impediments that we cannot continue to trip over, asked and answered, and we will think about implementation. We will think about scale for every patient at the heart of our industry and for every patient that we all exist to serve. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us over the last few days. We look forward to taking the next steps with you. Lots more to come.